Okay, this is section 6.4, completing the square. Now, to understand what completing the square is, it's a way to solve quadratic equations by forcing it to be able to factor. Okay, but to do that, you need to understand the square root property. We've done this before. It's just restating it again. Okay, if x squared equals some number, then x equals the positive or negative of the square root of that number. So if you took the square root of both sides, you have to take the positive and the negative. It means plus or minus, okay? So this is actually two answers. That's not just one, okay? So for instance, x squared equals 4. Well, to undo this square, I have to do the square root. So I take the square root of both sides. When I do that, I have to do plus or minus. It could be either, okay? So that means x equals the positive square root of 4, which is 2, and x equals the negative square root of 4, which is negative 2. Both of those are correct because if you think about it, 2 squared, well yeah, that's 4. Negative 2 squared, that's also 4. Okay, that's why it's both. Okay, so that's where a lot of our double answers are going to come from. And it works really well with perfect square trinomials. What is a perfect square trinomial? It's when you have this number, the b, half of that squared is that number. So for instance, x squared plus 10x plus 25. Don't worry about that right now. Okay, what's half of 10? 5. What's 5 squared? 25. What two numbers multiply to be that, but add to be that? It's this. So it becomes x plus 5 squared. That's how it factors. Okay? So what happens is, you take the square root of both sides. Well, what's the square root of 49? It's not just positive 7, it's also negative 7. So you take the square root to undo this square. Okay? Then you have x plus 5 equals both of those. So you do them separately. X plus 5 equals 7, and x plus 5 equals negative 7. You solve those separately and you get your two answers. Minus 5, minus 5. X equals 2 and x equals negative 12. Okay? Now we can force quadratics to become perfect square trinomials. Okay, by completing the square. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Alright? So, and this is the general form. I'm going to go over some problems with it. Let me go through the explanation. If you have x squared plus bx, you add b over 2 squared to get it to factor. Okay? And how does that factor? Well, if you add b over 2 squared, what it does factors to is x plus that b over 2, and then that whole binomial is squared. Okay? For instance, x squared plus 6x. Okay, b is 6. b over 2, which is 6 over 2 is 3. And then b over 2 squared, so that's 3 squared, that's 9, right? So if I add 9 to this, okay, it factors down to x plus b over 2 squared. What is b over 2? 3. X plus 3 squared. And I'll prove it to you. X plus 3 times x plus 3. Okay, that is that. I'll work it out. I'll FOIL it. That's x times x is x squared, plus x times 3 is 3x, plus 3 times x, plus 3 times 3. X squared plus 6x plus 9. That's the same thing in a different form, in a factored form. Okay? How does that help us? Well, it allows us to just take the square root of the other side. I'm going to show you with some problems here. Okay? So, first one here, and then this is the page, so you can see the answers for those problems. Some of them are here as well. Okay? So, number 32. And it says, solve each equation by completing the square. Okay? So we start with this, x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. The first step is move that constant to the other side. If you're completing the square, do that. Okay. Now, add blanks to both sides. Why both sides? Because we have to, if we add to one side, we have to add that to the other side. We have to make it, keep it balanced. Okay, if it's not balanced, it's not equal anymore. Okay, so whatever I have to add here, I have to add there. And what do I add there? Well, that comes from this. What is that number in front of the x term? Make sure you take the sign. Okay, so b is negative 8. What's b over 2? That's negative 8 over 2, so that's negative 4. And then you square that, and you get 16. That is what goes in the blanks. Okay? 16. Okay? So the right side, negative 15 plus 16, that just comes down to 1. Okay? The left side is now a perfect square trinomial. What does it factor to? X plus half that number, negative 4, and then squared, equals 1. Okay? The number that goes here is half that number if you did this right. If that is half that squared, half that goes here. So, to solve this, take the square root of both sides now using the square root property. Remember, when you take the square root, the square cancels, it's plus or minus the square root of 1, which is just 1. Now I have to do these separately, right? So x minus 4 equals a positive 1, and x minus 4 equals a negative 1. Excuse me. Plus 4, x equals 5, and then plus 4, x equals 3. Okay? Move the constant over first. Add your blanks. What goes in those blanks? You take that middle number in front of the x term. Not the x squared, the x. And by the way, this has to be 1. If that's not 1, we have to do something special. Alright, negative 8, b over 2 is negative 4. That number squared is 16. That's what goes in those blanks. This number is what it factors down to, x minus 4 squared. Watch your signs when it comes to this. That's the easiest, one of the easiest places to screw up is you forget to put that negative there. You forget to bring it back down here. Okay? Now let's look at one that gives us a nasty radical, an irrational number. Okay, it's number 34. Okay, so we have x squared plus 2x minus 6 equals 0. Okay? Now, sorry. That's what. Okay, so again, first thing, you move the constant over, and then you add your blanks. X squared plus 2x plus blank equals 6 plus blank. What's b? B is 2. What's b over 2? 2 over 2, which is 1. What's b over 2 squared? It's 1 squared, which is just 1. Okay, so 1 goes there, 1 goes there. Right side is 7. What does that factor to? X plus b over 2. What is b over 2? 1 squared. Now you take your square root of both sides. X plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. We can't simplify that, so we have to leave it like this. Okay? So then we subtract 1, and we get x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 7. You can leave your answer like this. Or if you want, you can write it out. X equals negative 1 plus the square root of 7, and x equals negative 1 minus the square root of 7. Either way works. Okay. Now you could get complex numbers with this. You could get an imaginary number if you had the square root of a negative. That's okay. That just means it doesn't cross at a real number. Don't worry about that right now, but just understand if you had like, well, I'll do the next one. 36, it'll give you an imaginary number. Okay. X squared minus 4x plus 5 equals 0. Move the constant over. X squared minus 4x plus blank equals negative 5 plus blank. You add your blanks. B is negative 4. b over 2, negative 4 over 2, which is just negative 2. What is that squared? Negative 2 squared is a positive 4. That's what goes in the blanks here. Alright, so I get x, this factors down to x plus b over 2. That's negative 2, so we do x minus 2 squared equals a negative 1. And then we take the square root of both sides. Square root of a negative number. It's imaginary. Remember, the square root of negative 1 is I. Okay? So that becomes x minus 2 equals plus or minus I. Okay? So that becomes then x equals, you add the 2 to both sides, 2 plus or minus I. And again, you can write it like this, or x equals 2 plus I, x equals 2 minus I. I'm going to write it like this just because it saves space and time, and it means the same thing. If you want to write it out, you're more than welcome to. Okay, but that's what I mean when I say plus or minus. You're doing both the plus version and the minus version. You got to take care of both. Now, all right. So, whenever you have a not equal to 1, that's when it gets a little messy. Okay, so for instance, number 38. All right, we have 2x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals 0. Okay, a doesn't equal 1, so divide everything by a. So, what is a here? A equals 2, right? Divide everything by a. Divide by 2, divide by 2, divide by 2, divide by 2. Okay, that's just going to be 0. That's so good. That's fine. That becomes 1. That becomes plus 3 over 2x minus 5 over 2. Yes, these are fractions. Yes, you're going to have to get used to them. Okay? So, again, at this point, it's the same process. The only thing different was we had to get that a equal to 1. The way to do that is you divide by that number that's in front of the x squared. Everything by it. Not just it, everything. Okay? So here, move my constant over. Okay? So I have x squared plus 3 over 2x plus blank equals 5 over 2 plus blank. What goes in the blanks? Well, excuse me. B equals a positive 3 over 2. B over 2. That's 3 over 2 over 2. I don't know if you remember the trick I told you. Whenever you have a fraction divided by a whole number, just multiply the two bottom numbers together. That equals 3 over 4. Okay? The other way to say that is 3 over 2 divided by 2 is the same thing as 3 over 2 times 1/2. Remember, you divide by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. That's why it's that. Okay, and then we do the b over 2 squared. So you have 3 over 4 squared. You square the top and you square the bottom. 9 over 16. That's what goes in the blanks. Yes, this is getting messy, but it's what you have to do. So, that, I'm going to move this over here, okay? That factors to x plus b over 2. What is b over 2? Well, we already have it figured out. 3 over 4 squared, okay? It just does. That's how it works. Okay, now we got to add these two together, and they have to have like denominators. So, what's the least common denominator of 2 and 16? 16. So that means I got to multiply this by 8 over 8. Okay, so 5 over 2 times 8 over 8 becomes 40 over 16. Alright, so 40 over 16 plus 9 over 16. Alright, and again, 3 over 4 squared, that's 49 over 16. Now I got to take the square root of both sides. Okay, so that cancels. So x plus 3 over 4. Now, that's plus or minus the square root of 49 over 16. And if you remember, you treat a square root just like you would a power. So what you do to one, you do to the other. You do the both. Okay, so it's the square root of 49 and the square root of 16. Plus or minus the square root of 49 over the square root of 16. Well, those we know. Okay, so x plus 3 over 4 equals plus or minus 7 over 4. Okay? Now, we split it up. X plus 3 over 4 equals 7 over 4, and x plus 3 over 4 equals a negative 7 over 4. You have to split it up and work them both out if you're not left with a radical. If you're left with a radical, you can just write it as one number and it'll be fine. The plus or minus. Here, you have to actually work it out. So you subtract 3 over 4 from both of them. X equals 7 over 4 minus 3 over 4. It's 4 over 4, which is just 1. And x equals negative 7 over 4 minus 3 over 4. That's a negative 10 over 4. It's a negative 5 over 2. Those are your two answers. Okay? So if there's a number in front of the x squared, the only difference is everything has to be divided by that number first. Then you do the normal process for completing the square. Okay? There's going to be fractions, and you could put decimals if you wanted, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's just going to complicate things for you. It's not going to actually help you, especially if you start to get radicals that are irrational. You can't round. You can't round to those numbers unless you're asked to round, and I'm not. And for these kinds of things, they're not going to ask you. Okay? So, except for maybe like 44 and 45, those have decimals in the answers, in the problems. So, but they still work out evenly. They don't have to round those. Okay, so that section, that's completing the square. Okay, I will post a worksheet for this, a study guide worksheet with this, with extra practice problems that will be due for a credit. And I'll post that with this, with the link to this video.